Everything you were taught about the fall of the British Empire is incomplete. You were told it was nationalism, you were told it was wars of independence, you were told colonies simply rose up and took their freedom by force, and that Britain, exhausted, finally let go. But that story, the one in the textbooks, the one repeated in classrooms for generations, leaves out the single most important cause of all. The British Empire did not fall because it lost battles on the field. It fell because it ran out of money. Behind every retreat, every granted independence, every quiet withdrawal from a colony, there was a ledger, a mounting debt, a currency under relentless pressure. This is the story historians rarely tell in full. The slow-motion financial collapse that brought down the largest empire in human history. One loan, one crisis, one devaluation at a time. To understand how an empire falls, you first have to understand what actually held it up in the first place. At its peak in the early 20th century, the British Empire controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land and a quarter of its population, spanning every inhabited continent on Earth. Ships flying the Union Jack moved across every ocean, from the Atlantic trade lanes to the ports of the Indian Ocean and beyond. Red touched every continent on the map. And the phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," was not just propaganda, it was, quite literally, geography. It looked from the outside like a purely military achievement, an empire built and held together by the Royal Navy and colonial armies stationed from Cairo to Calcutta. But the deeper truth, the one that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story, is that Britain's real power was never just its soldiers or its warships. It was London. Specifically, it was the City of London and the pound sterling. London was the undisputed financial capital of the entire planet. Global trade was priced in sterling. International loans were issued in sterling. Insurance contracts, shipping agreements, and cross-border debts around the world all ran through British banks and British institutions. That financial dominance, quiet, invisible, and largely unglamorous, was the actual engine of empire. The military was simply there to protect it, to guarantee that the system kept functioning. So when we ask what ultimately destroyed the empire, we should not be looking only at battlefields and treaties. We should be looking at balance sheets, at interest rates, and at the value of the pound itself. Keep that single idea in mind as we move forward, because every major turning point in this story, from the trenches of the First World War to the sands of Suez, traces back to the same quiet, unglamorous truth about where Britain's real strength actually lived. Before 1914, Britain sat at the center of global finance in a position that seemed almost unshakable. British investors held enormous overseas assets, funding railways stretching across Argentina, mines throughout South Africa, and plantations across Asia. The pound was the reserve currency of the world, trusted everywhere, backed firmly by gold, and treated by bankers on every continent as safer than holding cash itself. Then came the First World War, and everything began to change. The war did not just cost lives, staggering as those losses were. It cost Britain its financial supremacy, quietly and permanently. To fund the war effort, Britain borrowed enormous sums, much of it from the United States, a country that had until then been a junior partner in the global financial system. Government debt exploded to levels never before seen in British history. At the same time, Britain was forced to sell off huge portions of its overseas investments simply to pay for weapons, soldiers, ships, and endless supplies. Assets that once generated steady income for the British Treasury year after year were liquidated just to survive 4 years of brutal trench warfare on the continent. When the war finally ended in 1918, Britain had technically won. The map still showed the empire intact, even expanded with new mandates in the Middle East, but financially it had been gutted from the inside. Trade routes were disrupted for years. Competitors like the United States and Japan had expanded aggressively into markets Britain once dominated without contest. British industry, worn down by years of war production and starved of investment, struggled badly to modernize and compete on the world stage. The empire's foundation, that invisible financial infrastructure painstakingly built over more than a century, had visibly cracked. Britain was still the empire on the map, still ruling vast territories, but it was no longer the undisputed financial power standing behind that map. And once that foundation weakens, however slowly, everything built on top of it eventually becomes unstable, no matter how solid it still appears from the outside. If the war cracked the foundation, the next decision poured salt directly into that crack. In 1925, then Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill made a fateful choice, one that would be debated by economists for the next 100 years. He returned Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. On paper, this was meant to restore British prestige, to signal to the world that the pound was exactly as strong as it had been before the war, as if the previous decade of debt and destruction had simply never happened. In reality, it set the value of the pound roughly 10% higher than it should have been, given Britain's genuinely weakened economic position at the time. This single decision had brutal, cascading consequences. An overvalued pound made British exports significantly more expensive on the world market overnight. Coal, textiles, and manufactured goods, the very backbone of British industry for over a century, suddenly struggled to compete against cheaper foreign alternatives from Germany, America, and elsewhere. Factories across the country cut production sharply. Wages were slashed in a desperate attempt to compensate for the lost competitiveness. Coal miners, hit hardest of all by these wage cuts, eventually went on strike, culminating in the General Strike of 1926, a moment of near-total national economic paralysis that shut down transport, industry, and daily life across Britain. Unemployment climbed steadily, month after month, year after year. And then, just a few years later, the Great Depression arrived from across the Atlantic and made everything dramatically worse, turning what had been a self-inflicted wound into a full-blown, decade-long economic catastrophe. Historians and economists today largely agree on this specific point. Returning to the gold standard at that particular rate was not a strategic necessity forced upon Britain by circumstance. It was an avoidable mistake, driven more by pride and a nostalgic attachment to pre-war status than by sound, clear-eyed economic judgment. Britain chose to defend the appearance of strength instead of honestly adapting to its new, diminished reality. And that costly choice weakened the country dearly, right before the world would once again demand everything an empire had left to give. By the late 1930s, Britain was still slowly recovering from the previous 2 decades of financial strain when an even larger, more consuming war loomed on the horizon. World War II would not just test Britain's military resolve, it would finish off what little remained of its financial independence and hand the torch of global economic power to a new nation entirely, the United States of America. In the early years of the war, before America officially entered the fight, Britain desperately needed American weapons. Ships, aircraft, and raw materials to survive against a rapidly advancing Nazi Germany. But under United States law at the time, purchases from America had to be made under a strict policy known as cash and carry. Britain had to pay in hard cash up front and arrange the transport of the goods itself across a dangerous Atlantic Ocean. This drained Britain's gold and dollar reserves at an alarming, unsustainable rate. Within roughly a year, Britain was running dangerously low on the hard currency needed to keep purchasing the war materials it so desperately required to keep fighting. This is precisely where the Lend-Lease Agreement entered the picture in 1941, reshaping the entire relationship between the two nations. Instead of demanding immediate cash payment for every shipment, the United States agreed to lend or lease war supplies to Britain to be paid back later, or in many cases, simply returned after the war concluded. It sounds remarkably generous on the surface, and in terms of keeping Britain in the fight against fascism, it absolutely was essential and arguably decisive. But it also came with strings attached, some visible and some hidden. Lend-Lease made Britain thoroughly financially dependent on American goodwill for the remainder of the war. Every ship, every plane, every ton of supplies came bundled with an implicit understanding. America was now the senior partner in this alliance, not an equal one, standing shoulder to shoulder as it once had. When the war finally ended in 1945, Britain was, in strictly financial terms, devastated beyond easy repair. National debts were staggering, dwarfing anything seen after the previous war. Industry desperately needed rebuilding from the ground up. Currency reserves were nearly exhausted entirely. Then came the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, where the entire post-war global financial system was carefully designed by the victorious Allied powers. And crucially, decisively, the pound sterling was no longer placed at the center of that new international system. The US dollar was. The dollar became pegged directly to gold, and other currencies around the world, including the once mighty pound, were pegged instead to the dollar. The world's financial anchor had officially permanently shifted from London to Washington, and everyone in the room understood exactly what that meant. As if that historic shift were not enough on its own, Britain then desperately needed the Anglo-American loan of 1946, a massive emergency loan from the United States that came with strict conditions attached, including a demanding requirement to make the pound freely convertible far sooner than Britain's still fragile post-war economy could realistically handle. When Britain attempted that convertibility in 1947 as required, it triggered a currency crisis so severe and so immediate that the entire policy had to be suspended within a matter of weeks, step by step, agreement by agreement, loan by loan. The United States used financial leverage, rather than any single direct military confrontation, to systematically dismantle the exclusive financial position that had underpinned the entire British Empire for over a century. America did not need to fight Britain for global dominance on any battlefield. It simply had to outfinance it, patiently, loan by loan, agreement by agreement, until the old empire's economic engine effectively belonged to someone else entirely. By 1949, the pound was devalued again, sharply, from $4.03 down to $2.80, a stark public admission of just how far British purchasing power had fallen since the war began. Each of these individual moments seemed small on its own, a loan here, a conference there, a currency adjustment somewhere else. But stacked together across barely a single decade, they added up to something enormous. The quiet, largely bloodless transfer of the entire world's financial center of gravity from one side of the Atlantic to the other. The conventional narrative of decolonization tells a proud story of moral awakening and rising nationalist movements finally, heroically overcoming colonial rule after decades of struggle. That version is not false. Nationalist movements were absolutely real, deeply courageous, and central to the achievement of independence across dozens of nations. But it is incomplete on its own. Because underneath that political story lies a financial one that is rarely given equal weight in the popular retelling. By the late 1940s and increasingly into the 1950s, Britain was simply running out of the money required to maintain a truly global empire stretched across every continent, maintaining colonial administrations, funding military garrisons stationed abroad, and managing far-flung, often restless territories cost enormous sums that a debt-ridden, exhausted post-war Britain increasingly could not afford to keep spending. India, the so-called jewel in the crown, gained its independence in 1947, not purely as a triumph of political negotiation and nationalist pressure alone, but partly because Britain could no longer justify or afford the immense financial and administrative burden of holding on to it any longer. Similar financial pressures echoed loudly across Africa and Asia in the years that followed, from Ghana to Malaya. This is the uncomfortable financial reality sitting underneath the celebrated political story most of us learned in school. Colonies were not simply granted their freedom purely out of goodwill or purely because of exhausted resistance to nationalist movements. In many, many cases, they were let go because an empire in unmistakable financial decline could no longer afford the mounting price of holding on any further. If one single event symbolizes the true, unmistakable end of the British Empire as a genuine global power, it is the Suez Crisis of 1956. In July of that year, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a waterway of immense strategic and economic importance, connecting Europe to Asia, previously operated by a joint British and French company. Britain, together with France and Israel, launched a secret coordinated military plan to retake the canal by force before the world could react. Initially, remarkably, the operation succeeded militarily on the ground. Egyptian forces were pushed back decisively, and the canal zone was swiftly seized by Allied troops. But then came the moment that changed absolutely everything, a moment that historians now point to as the true end of empire. The United States, under President Dwight Eisenhower, refused to support the invasion publicly and firmly. Worse still for Britain, America signaled something far more devastating than mere diplomatic disapproval. Washington made clear it would sell off British bonds and refuse to support the pound sterling during a run on the currency, potentially triggering a full-blown catastrophic collapse of the entire British financial system almost overnight. Britain, still deeply indebted to the United States from 2 world wars, simply could not withstand that kind of overwhelming financial pressure applied so directly. Within days, mere days, Britain was forced into a humiliating, hasty withdrawal from Suez, abandoning the operation entirely despite its clear military success on the ground. This was the moment the entire watching world saw Britain get overruled, not by force of arms or by battlefield defeat, but by the simple, chilling threat of financial ruin. It proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Britain could no longer act as a truly independent global power on the world stage. Its actions were now firmly constrained by American financial leverage, whether British leaders liked it or not. Suez was not simply a diplomatic embarrassment to be smoothed over. It was the symbolic funeral of the British Empire as a genuinely independent global force, broadcast live for the entire watching world to witness in real time. This raises an uncomfortable, lingering question that historians and economists continue to debate fiercely to this day. Was the British Empire ever genuinely profitable in the way popular imagination so often assumes it must have been? Some economic historians argue persuasively that by the 20th century, maintaining the empire cost Britain considerably more than it ever earned back, once you properly account for military garrisons, colonial administration, and the endless string of overseas obligations that came with holding so much territory. Others push back firmly against this view, arguing that certain specific sectors and a small class of elite investors profited enormously even as the broader national balance sheet quietly suffered, meaning the costs and benefits were unevenly and unfairly distributed rather than uniformly negative for the country as a whole. What most serious historians and economists do broadly agree on, however, is this. By the mid-20th century, the empire had effectively become a financial liability. one carefully disguised by the psychological comfort of imperial prestige and national pride. Britain kept paying the bill for global influence and status long after the practical, tangible returns had clearly diminished, propped up by pride, rather than by sound, honest accounting. This nuanced, complicated reality complicates the simple hero or villain narratives so often told about empire and popular culture. It was neither purely a noble civilizing project, nor was it purely an economic engine of profit for Britain itself in its final decades. It was, increasingly and undeniably, an expensive habit that a declining financial power could simply no longer justify maintaining, no matter how much national identity was tied up in it. Perhaps the most honest answer is the least satisfying one. The empire had different meanings for different groups within Britain, profitable for a privileged few, and an unsustainable burden for the nation as a whole. Let's bring every single thread of this story together now, clearly and in order. First, the First World War forced Britain into crushing, unprecedented debt and stripped away its overseas financial assets, cracking the very foundation of empire for the first time. Second, the return to the gold standard in 1925 was a self-inflicted wound, an overvalued pound, that crushed British exports and deepened unemployment across the country for years. Third, the Great Depression compounded that existing damage severely, turning simmering economic weakness into a prolonged, decade-long national crisis. Fourth, the Second World War completed the transfer of global financial power to the United States through cash and carry, Lend-Lease, the Bretton Woods Conference, and the Anglo-American Loan, leaving Britain permanently financially subordinate to Washington. And fifth, the Suez Crisis of 1956 delivered the final, undeniable, public proof. When America applied direct financial pressure, Britain had absolutely no choice but to retreat immediately. Each of these five causes built directly and inevitably on the one before it. Debt led to a desperate, prideful gold standard decision. That decision deepened an already fragile economic collapse. The collapse left Britain fatally exposed, heading into a second devastating world war it could not possibly finance on its own. And that resulting financial dependence culminated years later in the public humiliation at Suez. This was never a single dramatic collapse captured in one newsreel. It was a slow, decades-long financial unraveling. One loan, one crisis, one overvalued currency at a time, largely invisible to ordinary people, until the very end. Here is why this particular piece of history matters far beyond old maps and faded sepia photographs in a museum somewhere. Today, the United States occupies a position strikingly similar to Britain's own in the early 20th century. The world's dominant reserve currency in the dollar, extensive and costly global military commitments spanning every continent, and a national debt burden that continues climbing higher year after year with no clear end in sight. This is not a confident prediction of imminent collapse. History rarely repeats itself in such a simple, direct, or convenient way, and America's specific circumstances differ from Britain's in several crucial respects worth acknowledging. But the underlying lesson nonetheless remains strikingly, uncomfortably relevant for our own time. Empires and global superpowers are not primarily undone on distant battlefields. However dramatic those battles may appear in the moment, they are undone, quietly and gradually, in ledgers, in currency markets, and in the slow, grinding arithmetic of national debt, outpacing the resources actually available to service it responsibly. Military strength can win individual wars, and even entire prolonged conflicts, but it cannot indefinitely mask genuine financial weakness lurking underneath the surface, no matter how impressive the parades or how large the navy. The British Empire did not fall in one single dramatic moment captured in a single iconic photograph for the history books. It fell gradually, almost invisibly, one debt, one devaluation, one desperate loan at a time, until the empire that once proudly ruled a quarter of the entire earth could no longer even hold a single canal it needed without first asking Washington's permission. And that, in the end, is the lesson genuinely worth remembering. The lesson this entire story has been building toward from the very first second. Not the battles you read about in school, not the treaties signed at grand conference tables, but the quiet arithmetic running underneath all of it, year after year, decade after decade. That is the real, unglamorous engine of history, whether we are talking about an empire from a century ago or a superpower standing today. Watch the ledgers, not just the headlines. Watch the debt, not just the flags. Watch who is lending to whom and who ultimately has to ask permission. Because in the end, empires don't fall when they lose wars. They fall quietly and completely when they lose financial power.